likes books. Dwayne, like, anyways, no, you're fine. Okay, hitting the blue go live button. Uh, and we're live. It's Wednesday, July 21st, 5:01 p.m. Eastern Time. And what are you laughing about?
Somebody said, "Are we allowed to talk about Marx after last night's outcome?"
Oh, yes. Right. Yes, exactly. I saw you tweeted that. It was pretty funny. But anyways, and we're not allowed to have fun anymore, except we sometimes do. Uh, and but we are allowed to have Dwayne Betts back on the show to just like chit chat with us about whatever he wants to talk about or not talk about because
We're not
creating a
talking about
longer
the
and
NBA
longer.
tonight. That's
Yeah.
that's that's the that's the rail that has been put up. We said to Dwayne before the show, "What do you want to talk about?" And he said, "Not the NBA." So there will be no further discussion of the NBA on this show.
Yeah. Wait,
Yeah,
really? Now I want to talk
Just,
about it. I've
ju-
never
just,
wanted to talk about the
just
NBA
recurrent
before.
references to Milwaukee without in a seemingly unmotivated sort of way.
Okay.
yeah. This is the best thing to happen to Milwaukee in sports, and since Oscar Robertson. So I could accept that. Apologies to those people, Green Bay Packer fans, who have a whole history of Brett Favre and that other guy who quarterbacks for them that they're trying to get rid of that I'm just completely unaware of.
Uh, well, you brought up an interesting premise before we started about whether or not playing more sports and caring more about sports would make our politics less like sports. I kind of wanted to stage that as a poll.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know, Ben. Do you have any? Do you think that that could possibly be true? Like seriously?
Well, I do think that the team aspect of politics has acquired a sports fan like quality, a tribal quality, Yankees versus Red Sox kind of rivalry that is utterly substanceless, which in sports is, of course, fine. That's the way it's supposed to be. You have your tribe that you're part of, that you care about. It has colors. It has, and one side wins and the other side loses. And I think that uh, I do think there are people who feel that way about politics. Now, and I think that's bad. Now, whether we could um, redirect that energy to getting them into sports so that they don't feel like that way about politics, I'm skeptical. But I do think there's truth to it. The the right, in my view, the right approach to politics is to constantly be looking at the Venn diagram overlap between you and whoever you're perceiving your opponent to be. So and so is hateful on all of these things, but we agree on this very narrow slice of life, so we work together on that. That's not the way you do things in sports. And so
Or
I,
politics. I mean, it's so funny because you remember. I mean, I remember when I was young and the way I first got engaged with sports. It's wild because ESPN offered a kind of like blueprint about how you might imagine engaging with sports, whereas every team was covered. And so on some baseline level, you understood that like Ken Griffey was great and he was hitting 7 home runs in a row, but you also knew that Tony Gwynn was chasing 400, right? And so you had a sort of baseline understanding of like all of these teams, all of these players, in all of these sports, right? And I don't think it was like MSNBC and 24-hour news. It might have existed in the same way. This funny thing is like remember when I was young and we didn't have a lot of money, and so we didn't go to restaurants as a family. I didn't know like 5-star restaurants existed. And then you tack on the fact that I went to prison from 16 to 24. So I come home and I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of restaurants that you could just go to and sit down and eat. Did they just invented this? And I know I sound like really naive, but like imagine like so maybe they had 24-hour news in 1993, but I distinctly don't remember it existing. And so now I think about when I started watching news obsessively, probably 2005, when I got out of prison. Maybe even before that, while I was in prison, CNN, MSNBC, I realized that it does something very, very different from what ESPN did. It doesn't equip me to understand the whole spectrum. It's almost as if I was like just watching Yankees television. And they do have those stations, right? Where it's just like the Yankee sports station. And I never watched those because those aren't entertaining. But I feel like our news has veered towards that. You could find it if you want. If you watch Fox, it's just like watching the Yankees 24/7. If you watch MSNBC, it's almost, you can't get the Venn diagram from
Yeah,
those
no, that's
outlets.
that's a really interesting point because when we do, um, you know, it would actually be possible to have a very high substance 24-hour news channel. The problem is that nobody would watch it
It'd be
because,
C-SPAN.
well, even if it were reported news, right? You would do your top few news stories, and then you would what's going on in Cambodia, right? And the answer is the average news consumer doesn't give a rat's ass what's going on in Cambodia, or pardon me, Petra, in the Czech Republic, right? In the broad American news ecosystem. And so what the news channels decided is that they had to do the same top two or three stories
Yeah.
over and over and over again. And so it's not actually a 24-hour news channel. It's actually 24 hours on two stories or three stories. And that's becomes very much like the Yankees channel or
They literally show reruns of old games. It's like exactly what you're talking about.
It's probably worse than the Yankees channel though, because it's like the last 5 games the Yankees played, as opposed to like, those stations at least feel the desire or the need to try to pull you into like what happened 30 years ago to fully understand the Yankees. It's kind of depressing. I don't know how my yeah, it's a funny. It's like, and then when you live locally, it was a big story in New Haven, right? Um, when I was here, speaking of sports, this is the overlap. I got asked to be on this press conference, and at first the press conference was to push the the um the legislator here to pass a new bill on solitary confinement. But they passed it. They got the House and the Senate to agree. It passed through the House and the Senate, and it was severely limiting the use of solitary confinement. And it was like fantastic, right? And all that was necessary was the governor to sign the bill. Now, ultimately, the governor didn't sign the bill, but what's really interesting is that it wasn't news. It was literally news for like 3 hours. And I know that the Lyman Clinic, the Lyman program here at Yale, they spent years studying the numbers of solitary confinement. And I know that, Hope Metcalf worked on it. And I know that Robert Fairchild, people have been doing community work for like decades, worked on this. And you would think, all they needed to do was be signed by the governor. But he vetoed it. It's like, I refuse to sign this. And it's amazing to think that this happened and it wasn't news at all. When you would think that in the era of mass incarceration, it would have been national news. So it's not even they don't care about Cambodia. It's like we actually don't care about Connecticut.
Well, that's really interesting. So I'll give you another example just from my personal life. In 2019, I haven't run the numbers of this, but 2018, 2019, I was on MSNBC, yeah, sort of every other day, every 3 days. It was like a second job. And that's because the Trump legal stuff in 18 and 19 were the number one story basically all the time. In 2020, that drops to probably the third or fourth story after election and pandemic. I wasn't on television at all. Like not, maybe 10 times over the course of the year, 15 times over the course of the year. And so just dropping from the top two national stories to the fourth or fifth national story reduces the airtime of discussion of something to near zero. Now, look, I'm not complaining about that. I think it was perfectly reasonable to cover the pandemic and the election obsessively. But, query whether we were over covering Trump legal issues for a couple of years and then under covering them for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And, I think, and I would love to see the 24-hour news station that had time for Cambodia and that had time much less for Connecticut. I think but I think the ratings for that channel would be trivial, and I think it's the networks here are ultimately a reflection of popular sort of wisdom of crowds voting with feet, and I think it's a really we don't actually want the news. We want something that has a sports like quality that we can tell ourselves is news. And I think it's it's an interesting question. Would we do better if we just had sporting gladiatorial competitions for that stuff, and then news was news?
Yeah, I really do wonder. So this reminds me of I was reading I think I've talked about this on the show before, but just in case, the New York Times did this incredible retrospective a couple of weeks ago of the team that had read and dissected the Pentagon papers and how they had set up a hotel room, a number of hotel rooms, and how they let people in on it, and all the ways they dealt with the potential legal issues coming out of it. And so this is super interesting, super in the weeds stuff. All of these top secret documents that are getting released by the news, and they kind of work on it for months and months and months to prep for it. They finally put it out, and no one does anything with it. No one knows what it is or what they're talking about, and why it's a big deal. And it's not a big deal really, according to this retrospective of them talking about it. You okay? Is there a bat in your house? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Keep going.
But there was just this retrospective of well, basically they just kind of said that there was a I don't know, whatchamacallit. The government tried to obviously get them to take it down, and that created the entire debacle around the Pentagon papers, was actually the censoring of them. And so I don't know, I just thought it was kind of fascinating that there was that half the story of the Pentagon papers didn't become, it wasn't clear what people were supposed to do with it until it became a story about the government trying to keep you from seeing this, if that makes sense. Because I feel that fits into this kind of framework of tribalism, but the rest of it was just too much information. I don't know.
Isn't that every story though? I think that's the apologies too, man. That was somebody trying to deliver some news to me, and I was just
Is that your kid?
it was FedEx. It was FedEx. But no, I think it's interesting though, because I wonder how I am expected to sort through reality as a writer, and how am I supposed to sort through reality for the public, to the degree that I get to talk to the public, when I actually have a hard time figuring out what matters. And the best case scenario, actually the best news consumption I get is when I just look at every page of the newspaper. I don't even read every page, I just look at every page and figure out what I want to read.
So how do you do it? Everybody has a kind of rubric for absorbing the news. Mine is super eccentric. What's yours? How do you how do you do it? There's an infinite amount of information out there. A crap ton of it is bad. So what's your system?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, right? Because I think, one, you don't get taught to have a system, right? And so
right.
I would say first, I've never been taught to have a system. And you can't subscribe to every newspaper. I would say it start with the New York Times because it forces me to slow down, and then I would say it's sort of self-serving, right? Because I started with the New York Times when I was being published there, and I was like, I want to see my piece, but also when I wanted to be published there, and I'm watching what's going on, so I'm flipping through the whole thing, and I think that the physical paper just works better for me. I'm flipping through the whole thing, and I got a roster of like 3 or 4 podcasts that I listen to, and some like Marketplace I listen to just because they serve as a kind of curating function for me to think about the top news that's out. And then, frankly, I follow a few people on Twitter and I pay attention to what they say. And then I disconnect from Facebook because I realized that Facebook is not giving me access to any news. And then and then it's a few other things I do that I don't know if they're not like newsy, but they're like information type. So I listen to you guys. I listen to Econ Talk, which is like radically not what I'm supposed to listen to in a way.
Econ Talk is great.
I love Econ
Well, I
Talk.
know, but if you talk about the like sort of intellectual, what do you listen to, and you make a list of like progressives, and it's not going to be Econ Talk. It's going
Right.
to be something else. And so, but I listen to Econ Talk faithfully. I listen to Glenn Laurie, then I listen to a few other folks, and then I try to skim the Wall Street Journal. And when somebody I know recommends something, that's some like a particular long form article, I'll check it out. And you got the few podcasts that do long form stuff that I try to check out. And then I read books every once in a while. I added a bunch of stuff in that list that I don't do, just to sound smart.
What do you do, Kate? What's your
Um,
system?
I get up and I think probably 15 times a day, I probably refresh the front page of the New York Times. And I skim through and I see like what the top news is in the New York Times, and then I kind of scroll down until I find things that just honestly just strike me as something I'm interested in. Like I'm curious to know more than what the headline says. Like that's like, and then I like open them all in tabs and then I read them. And then like that's how I like directly get the news, and the rest I get from Twitter or people sending me things or doing things that way. Occasionally when really big news is kind of breaking or things are happening, I will flip all over the place to different landing pages and see what their headlines are and see what their coverage is and who has stuff up and who doesn't, just cuz I kind of know how news breaks, and like it's kind of interesting to me to see how people are breaking different things. But like, and then like there was something about the pandemic where I just stopped being able to listen to podcasts. I don't know. I've stopped listening to them. I listen to Econ Talk. John occasionally plays a podcast or two for me. He really likes Tyler Cowen's like questions and like whatever.
He's cool. He got some few really great ones actually. That one with Dana Goa is pretty fantastic actually.
Yeah.
He's very bright.
Really good.
Yeah.
I find his questioning style like incredibly grating, so I can really only like for some reason, but I really like the substance of his guests and everything. Anyway, so they've been I don't know, and then I really like I really used to listen to This American Life, and I still love This American Life. Like I still think it's one of like the better, and Radio Lab. Little overproduced these days, but like just generally, I don't know. So that's pretty much it. But like none of that, but you know this about me, Ben, like I don't participate in politics.
No,
like,
but you have really, like, you have very deep access to news in the areas that you care about.
yes.
And so, if something happens in the content moderation department, you know about it almost immediately. Is that from targeted news consumption, or is that because somebody texts you?
Texts me almost always, which is a great point. Someone will send, and sometimes it's the companies, or the reporters, but people will send me things. But also because I'm often being asked for a quote on something that's happening with the companies or with the social media space, and so like I hear about it or get kind of a download on it from people. But it's just kind of what we were just saying. There's like a certain amount to like, it's the same story over and over again. Like that's pretty much always what I've like kind of like, that's like the thing. I now get a call from like a reporter or something on a story, and I haven't seen it appear anywhere yet, or I haven't seen like a press release. and they're telling me that something has happened. Did you hear that such and such happened? And Twitter's taking down this person and blah, blah. Well, like, I just have followed this space enough for enough years that I know every instance that they've done this before, every instance where they haven't, what the outcome is going to be, how to fit this into, like, everything else that's going on. It's just very easy. Like, it's just my job at this point. So, but yeah.
I have two horror stories, but I would say one is interesting, right? I subscribed to the Richmond Times because I was following a friend's case. And then I started to read them pretty consistently. And when the Virginia Parole Board released this guy did 40 years. He had killed a police officer. He did 40 years, and they released him. And in the paperwork, when
and just for listeners, for viewers who don't know, the Virginia Parole Board grants parole almost never.
Right. Before...
It was banned entirely in what, 98 or
94. And
94.
So everybody who was growing up had been locked up since 1994, and consistently nobody made parole. And so they grant parole to this guy who did 40 years. And within some of his paperwork, they had correctional officers saying that he's the most peaceful person they've ever met, that he stopped riots, that he stopped stabbings, and it was a huge media outcry against that grant of parole. And I was reading the Richmond Times following a different case, and then every week it was somebody writing an op-ed criticizing the parole board, and every op-ed was absurd. And so I ended up suspending my subscription. And what it reminded me of is sometimes the local paper has to do some of that same, at least in the op-ed page, some of that same work that the national press has to do. There's one horror story. I wanted somebody mentioned because they called me and asked me did I want to resubscribe, and when I told them no, and I told him why, the person was kind of aghast. He was like, but that's just a small bit of what we do. I mean, like his column doesn't even matter. Are you serious? You know, like, and I couldn't get over how antagonistic I felt towards that one column, which made me feel bad because then I realized I was buying into the same game more broadly because, you know, it is just a slice of what they do. But I was just like, I can't.
It's true, although the Richmond Times-Dispatch is so proudly retrograde on criminal justice issues. I mean, it's that column. I don't think that column would have bothered you that much if it didn't stand for a whole set of attitudes that the paper, in fact, does represent. And
right,
you know, as somebody who, when I was writing editorials for the Post, would sometimes really suck in my gut at what the Times-Dispatch had to say on the same cases. That, you know, it was horrifying.
It was. I honestly, I just thought anybody could be a columnist, and then I. But the other piece that was funny. So somebody mentioned Amy Goodman, and I've only ever been invited once to Democracy Now, and I think you asked to talk about this, Kate, and I was like, I'm good. About that Harper's letter. So I shouldn't even say this because somebody's going to listen to this, and I'm never going to get invited anywhere again. After the Harper's letter, I was invited on BBC. Democracy Now, NPR, and a few other spots that have never been interested in anything I had to say, and I declined them all, you know. And I wrote one thoughtful, I thought it was thoughtful, to one person that I've been on that show before, and I said, look, you know, I just last week I wrote an op-ed trying to get somebody released from prison talking about parole practices in Virginia. It got rejected by every national newspaper. A week later, this person was given a pardon. So clearly I had something to say that was important on the matter, but the mainstream news media didn't care about it. And then I signed this letter, and the letter literally is like 3 paragraphs, and is the most innocuous thing that's been written about a subject like this probably ever in life. And 5 different national organizations want to talk to me, and I was like, I'm sorry, I'm okay, I don't want to do it. I thought it was thoughtful. I did not get a response back.
That's hilarious. That's totally, oh God, I forgot about the Harper's letter. I know what I want to ask you about. You mentioned that you listen to Glenn Lowry. And yeah. I find him like fascinating, and I'm a little surprised you listen to him. He has a fascinating life story. Have you ever heard his whole life story?
Yeah,
Do you know this, Ben?
No.
So fill me in if I'm doing this wrong, but there is this, speaking of podcasts, there is this fantastic Love and Radio podcast in which he's interviewed, and he's just like edited It's called The Enemy Within. John reminds me, and he's like my little he's like my little bug in my ear, giving me like things to say, so I sound smart. But it was this is an incredible story of growing up I think in Chicago, and he's just very, very bright and very, very smart, like working class family, and I think his parents get divorced. I don't remember. But in any event, he gets into college at like 16 and starts going to college at like City College or something in like what is some place that's not that great in Chicago. He does so well that he is like sponsored to go to Northwestern. And at this point, he gets his girlfriend pregnant, I think, at like 18. And and then he marries her. And they proceed to like, he goes to Northwestern. I don't know. I forget. I'm gonna like mess it up, Dwayne.
So hold up.
So
what happens is he goes to college really, really young. Then he drops out to take care of his family, and then he ends up, and that relationship doesn't work out. And then he goes, and then he goes back to college. And part of this is because he really wanted to make his father proud, and he was like disappointed at how he was represented in the world. Goes back to college, ends up becoming an economist, ends up, I think, graduating from MIT when it was one of the best schools for that in the world, let alone the country. And then he ends up being like the youngest tenured black professor at Harvard as an economist, and he's at the height of his profession. And then he scandal jumps off, and he ends up like either losing his job or resigning. But it was interesting though, and yes, that happened. But what's really interesting is he actually felt like he couldn't cut it, and that's why he resigned. He didn't know if he deserved the position that he was in, or if he could continue to produce the work that he was producing. And so he resigned, and he had this huge scandal. He had an extramarital relationship, and then he became a born-again Christian. And then he ended up going to Boston College, Boston University, building his career back up. But what's fascinating, and then publishing like a bunch of papers in the top economist journals, and now he's back on the top of his profession, so to speak. But one of the reasons why he's fascinating, though, is because he's kind of libertarian. He kind of like he's kind of antagonistic.
He served in the Reagan administration.
Yeah, but he wrote Social Capital though. His PhD thesis was on the idea of social capital, which I think is a really radical and a really race conscious and poverty conscious understanding of the way in which we move through the world. And so I think frequently people forget some of his early work and the significance of his early work. And also he's been speaking against incarceration and mass incarceration for quite a long time. But the reason why I think he rubs against people the wrong way is because he's like deeply invested in this idea that you should be able to radically transform the way you live life. And I think that it's a tension between what he feels like is personal responsibility and agency, and what he might feel like is coming from certain progressives as being putting too much weight on a system and too much onus on a system as opposed to on an individual. But what's different from him, and I'll just say this and I'll leave it alone, what I like about him, or what I respect about him, is a lot of people talk about these issues, and we have a hard time talking about issues from where we came from. And he really did come from having to work through a lot of serious problems. And maybe it's a twinge of like, if I did it, you could do it, and some of what he says. But I do think that he speaks from like some deep desire for people to have better lives than we frequently do.
And so who were the other...
Ben, you're muted. Oh, sorry. No, you're not.
No, he's not.
Sorry.
So,
John must have told you to say that.
So who were the other of the sort of prominent black conservative intellectuals? Who were the others that you have particular respect for, or think are particularly interesting? Whatever disagreements you might have with them.
I guess I would have to say McWhorter, though I have deep disagreements with McWhorter. And then
see, because
I don't
think
know
that he's less less conservative than Glenn Lowry.
Yeah, I don't believe what
Maybe
what McWhorter says about a lot of things sometimes, and but I don't know. It's weird though. And somebody said shorthand for black conservative, and maybe Glenn would be conservative. I don't know what that means though. Honestly, like.
Yep.
And he's not a politician, and so I don't even know what it means when you call me progressive. It's like hire prosecutors. That disqualifies me in a lot of spaces already. And so I think so. I don't know. I don't know who I would say though. I listen to him, and then a lot of people I listen to, like Riley. I read some of the stuff he says, listens to some of the stuff, or Thomas Sowell. It's hard to parse it out, and maybe that's because we think about, if you ask me who are the black progressives I listen to, I mean, the list is equally as short, and it goes back to how do you get news consumption. I could better answer like what books I've read by people, what essays that I'm more appreciating right now than I could say like what voices. And mainly I think it's because like I'm 40 and I don't I don't want to make a list of people I follow in that way, particularly when we're talking about people who aren't consistently like putting out news and information on a broad array of things.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm gonna start bringing in audience questions, and
Oh, but Ben never told us how he consumes media though.
oh yeah,
we
Ben, you have to tell
we
me.
Oh,
embarrassed
gosh.
ourselves.
That's true.
So I have I think, four-part scheme to my news consumption. And this is totally embarrassing to say, but it's a system that I've developed that I'm committed to all four parts of, even the embarrassing ones. So the first is lop off the entire world that I don't need to know about and consume nothing about it. So when I joke about, you know, pop culture things that I don't know about, there's a joke in there, but there's also an intellectual decision that this is just, and most of sports is this way for me too. That I just need to know nothing about this, not because I look down on it or just because it's not in the universe of things in the world that I'm going to spend time on. It's not one of them. And so I just don't, and I don't consume anything about it. This saves an enormous amount of time. Everybody's got stuff like this that you feel a certain ambient awareness or need to learn about, and you just decide, no, I'm not doing that. And that actually frees up a large amount of time as you're consuming media. You know, if certain names, certain subjects are in it, you just don't consume it. The second group is the list of things that I'm content not to know about, but will absorb if they're interesting or if something makes me. So, Jeff Bezos going to outer space and the fact that the rocket is shaped like a dick doesn't interest me at all. I don't need to know about it, but it comes across my Twitter feed and I don't object to knowing about it. So that's the stuff that you're not walling yourself off from, but you're. The third category is, and I agree very much with Dwayne that the best way to consume news is actually to sit down and actively read or look at the entirety of the paper. But I do it with these two previous rules in mind. If it's about the stuff that I don't need, that I don't follow, I skip it. And if it's about stuff that I kind of eyeball and see if it may be interesting, fine. But I focus on the things that I actively need to know about. And then the fourth rule, and there's actually a fifth. The fourth and basic rule is that I delegate certain learning to other people on my behalf. I never tell them I'm doing this, but for example, I rely on Kate to tell me what I need to know and read about content moderation. If it comes up on the show and she tells me something interesting happens, that then I'll make a note. Okay, I got to figure that out. There are all kinds of people. I use the Lawfare podcast for this a lot. Some interesting developments happen in cybersecurity over the weekend. I say, who do I want to talk to about that? I want to talk to Matt Tate, and and Dmitry Alperovitch, and I have them kind of walk me through it, and that guides me as to what I need to read. And then the final list of things, this narrows the world down a lot if you do it this way, these 4 rules. And the following leaves the things that I actually need expertise in. And on those issues, I don't read news at all. I read the primary sources. So, you know, the Tom Barrack indictment, I haven't read a single news story about it. There's a 45-page indictment, and it's my job to know that. And it's to read the primary sources in there. The stuff that I work on for Lawfare, it's my job to know dramatically more than what's in the news. And so I think that's my basic rubric. It's four basic rules as to how to behave, and everything that's the stuff that's left is the stuff that I actually need to read myself.
No, that's interesting. I'm glad you went last. Because one, I'd have just been like, no, I mean, a lot of what Ben said is what I do. I think that we should tell college students that when they're trying to figure out how to understand the world, some of it I think we actually do naturally, but those last 2, I think is where the gold is. You know, how to figure out who it is, who are the experts of the things that we care about, and actually try to be rigorous.
How to not be ashamed of that. Like, yeah. I don't have time to do all the reading Kate's going to do on content moderation. The companies aren't texting me with
But also, it's not new. A lot of it's not new. You don't have to do all the reading, because like I can sift it through for you and tell you what.
No, but that's what I mean. Yeah. I mean, like, but having, like, you know, go-to people within my world who I can say, hey, you know, Kate's instinct are similar to mine, you know, but she actually focuses on this shit. So we check in every now and then. And by the way, it's not just Kate, it's also Evelyn Dweck, it's Quinta, you know, it's a bunch of people. But, you know, they cover that world for me. Certain other people cover certain other worlds. And then my job is to go deep on the things that I can go deep, and just be willing to be shallow on the other stuff and unashamed of it.
Yeah. I know you I made fun of me, and it was like a joke that I didn't listen to politics because the Trump stuff got me so upset. But one of the other things was like, I was working so hard on my area of expertise that I just didn't have room in my brain to figure out to like hold all of the details of like the Mueller report, like in my brain, and every breakout that happened and like everything else. And so like, it's a giant gaping hole of like information I don't have a lot of information on. I mean, so too like the last like 3 World Series, because I just was like, I'm just busy. I don't care. No, I think. I don't know.
the Mueller report is a really good example. Like, that was something that, okay, I had followed this investigation really closely. When the Mueller report came out, it was my job to read it really fast and then read it really deeply. And, you know, I kind of did a diary of my reading of it. But it's like, not like I didn't read a single news story about the Mueller report. I just worked with the document and, you know, mined that document for everything I could get from it, and then went and talked to a lot of people, you know. And so that's not news consumption. That's something else. And so, knowing where, to me, the key is knowing where something fits into the constellation of the knowledge that you're trying to build and the role that you're trying to play in conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Auntie. Hi.
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah, how's Finland?
Well, it's actually now getting dark, so, you know, but it's almost 1.
Yeah.
So.
Jeez. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah. So the U.S. Poet Laureate. So how big of a deal is it these days? And does the position and the weight it carries, does it shift with political winds? You know, right, left, etc.
What do you think, Dwayne? Do you know much about the
It's
poet laureate?
a little bit. I mean, I know like I think Joy Harjo was the poet laureate under President Trump, which is interesting because, but I think actually, unless I'm completely mistaken, the poet laureate is chosen by the Library of Congress, which means that it's not completely connected to the presidency, and so you'll have what seems like a strange pairing. Joy Harjo during President Trump, and it's like, is that who he would chose? I don't know what kind of weight the poet laureate carries, though. It's really an interesting question because they do work and they do a lot of work within the community, but it's almost like local news, the work they do. So the people who know about it are the people who touch by it, the people who go through the White House, the people across the country participate in the programming. But I don't think it has the same social impact. And what's interesting though, if you would have said the choice for who is the like the inaugural poet, I think that's radically different because Amanda Gorman's selection this year was a huge deal, and I think profoundly changed her life. But arguably, when President Obama chose Elizabeth Alexander, that radically changed her life too. I mean, she was a well-respected and an excellent poet before that. Um, and I don't know, so she might disagree with this, but it feels like she entered after that in several stages of a different kind of professional life to the point that now as the president of the Mellon Foundation, she's having a profound effect on like culture in the United States and on philanthropy in the United States, and particularly on my work because the Mellon Foundation is funded on Freedom Reads. But that's an interesting question because I don't know if I can make the same case anyway for somebody else other than Elizabeth Alexander. I couldn't make it for Blanco, who was the second poet laureate under Obama, and I'm not sure if I could make the case. I can't name really any other, not poet laureate, but inaugural poets. I can't name any other inaugural poets. So I don't know. I think that if I was the poet laureate, I would think that it was really cool, and I would tell everybody, and it would be a big deal amongst my universe. But it's sort of like my universe is one of poets. I think that most other people would say, "Oh, Dwayne's the poet laureate. Hey, what is that? What does that mean? So I don't know."
Yeah, I like that. Let's see, Paula. Go blue. Nice T-shirt.
Thank you. First or second question?
I like both of them.
Okay. So my first question is, Dwayne, what are your thoughts on the usefulness of pain in poetry? But I think also being aware that it is pain and not glamorizing it, because I think so many people who create good works of art have had painful moments or have had some type of, I guess, torture in their life, like depression. But I think people nowadays sometimes use that to excuse really awful behavior or to glamorize things like having depression, when in reality, there are people who are not famous who have depression and are not living, a very glamorous life. And my I'll ask my second question after you can answer that.
But I mean, that's in some ways that's really hard because I mean, one is always the presumption that what a person writes about they've directly experienced as a poet, and that's not true. But in the contemporary moment, the poet writes with I a lot, and so sometimes sometimes they write about themselves a lot, but that doesn't mean that they're always writing about themselves. And I think when you say like the I contains multitudes, that is like literal and figurative. Like Reginald Dwayne Betts, contain multitudes, but when I use the pronoun I imagine that contains multitudes and know that it does because sometimes the experience I'm writing from is radically not my own. But if you're writing about a traumatic or a painful experience, or if you're writing about somebody who just ain't shit, and you keep and so what happens is you don't want to turn your work into a way to like just to edify yourself. So when it's good things, it's like blah 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 blah, and I come off good. But then if it's something horrible, it's like and Joseph blah 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 blah, right? And so me as a poet, I use I, and sometimes it's me and sometimes it's not for that very reason, because I don't want to always feel like I'm positioning the pain outward. I want to feel like I'm bringing it to myself. And then to the bigger question of the uses of pain and the function of pain in poetry, I think it really does depend on the skill of the writer, because I write poems that I think sometimes are dark and sometimes deal with painful experiences, but the idea is that the poem isn't ever simply that. And if I do it right, then you could go beyond that. I got a poem that says something like my noon temptation, is now the Metro's third rail. But the poem is supposed to be far more than that. The poem is supposed to be this person grappling with the whole trajectory of their experience of incarceration and post incarceration, and finally concluding that like they're trying to get to a moment where it's okay to regret the things that they've done and work to move past it. I think that's sometimes we act as if it's not okay to regret what we've done. So,
Yeah.
You. So my second question is, I think, what are your thoughts on that the facts of the fans of athletes or the people who are involved in politics or view it as a game but actually not knowledgeable are crazier than the athletes or politicians themselves? Like, I remember watching the soccer game last week, and to see, fans of a soccer team turn so racist so quickly, when I know as an athlete, the athletes were not feeling like that way. That was such a, I'm sure, an awful defeat, but I know that athletes don't think that way. And I see, like, I don't know if you guys saw this on Twitter, there's a video of Ted Cruz like confronting someone who's talking about election fraud, and you can see in his eyes that he does not believe what this person believes. And yet, here we are, and he's going along with it while his supporters are probably crazier than he is.
Yeah, but here you're there is a category error in the comparison between politics and athletics, because look, a soccer team's job is to play soccer. It's not to mediate the political attitudes of its fans. Whereas and that's not in any way to excuse the behavior of fans who, expressed horrible stuff, but ultimately a soccer team's job is to play a game of soccer. A political leader's job is actually to mediate the political views of their constituents, to represent them, but also to moderate them, and to be the vehicle through which the reasonable aspirations of a majority of constituents, and that reasonable in there gets represented. And so when Ted Cruz is not pushing back against constituents who believe crazy things, that is actually a failure on his part. And so I think that's his job is not actually to say, I am the chief lemming, and if my crew wants to run off this cliff, let me lead them. So I don't, this is an area where I don't think politics and sports quite align. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I also think that I think that most athletes. I mean, the one thing I'll take issue with the form of the question with Paula always asks great questions, so I have no problem. I will say that there are some people who are really terrible racists that are athletes, that there have to be, there's just by the law of numbers, there are just going to be bad people. That had nothing to do with kind of everything that happened. With
Jackie Robinson's problem wasn't just with fans.
Right, exactly. Right, precisely. Richard Wattenberger.
Hello.
Nice to see
everybody. Nice to see you. Dwayne, nice to see you back
It's
on
a
here.
pleasure. Yeah.
So I'm curious. This week we saw the first convictions and sentencing of the Capitol insurrectionists, and people were, the prosecutor had recommended 18 months in prison. The judge sentenced him to 8, and I'm just curious, from your perspective, how do you go about thinking about when is a sentence lenient or appropriate or too extreme? And do you have any well-defined thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question, and I think it's easier to it's the question becomes more plain when you think about, say, the Chauvin case, where somebody gets 22 and a half years, and you have people saying that that's lenient, or that's not enough time. And obviously, I think like 22 and a half years is enough time. And I'm not sure if anybody should ever be sentenced to more than 20 years. The question that you mentioned is much harder because I was once hiring a prosecutor, and she was explaining how her only trial was for a DUI case. And somebody asked, "Did you get a conviction?" And she was like, "Yes, I got a conviction." And she was proud of it. And I said, "Well, what was the sentence?" Because everybody asked questions and she didn't mention the sentence. She said 6 months. And I thought, oh, so you think it's okay to send somebody to jail for 6 months? And I'm assuming that she might have had children. You didn't mention that. I know that she probably had a job, an apartment. She clearly lost that. She was working. Like what went into whether or not you thought that 6 months was going to be a benefit or a detriment to society? And and it was a tense interview after that moment because clearly I was antagonistic to the idea of 6 months being a reasonable response to a DUI. And I also asked different questions like, did she ever have one of those breath locks on her car? Like, what measures have been taken to ensure that she wasn't endangering the public if she couldn't deal with her alcoholism? But my point is that like 8 months isn't an amount of time that I think it could ruin the rest of your life, and it becomes this real question about what do you communicate with that 8 months. And in some sense, you say 8 months is legitimate. In this case, it's clearly a longer sentence wasn't available, and you argue that the 8 months was legitimate, not for what it would do to the individual, but what it signals to the public. And I guess there is some room for this kind of signaling that happens when people get sentenced to time in prison. But I think if I cop to that, I'm admitting that I'm not trying to discuss any in any way at all any kind of metric for whether or not that's a deserved amount of time in prison, because I recognize that 8 months could profoundly ruin your life, and I'm just not sure if anybody should go to prison for 8 months. I mean, if it's only 8 months, it just seems like you should find an alternative response to that conduct, because 8 months would profoundly change my life and my children's life. And it is not the kind of sentence that I think would repair some harm that was caused or radically transform me. Where when you say I'm sending you away for 10 years, you get a timeout. And you have to like seriously think about who you are and who you want to be in the world. And so I think it's a really difficult question, but I would probably argue that nobody should ever be sent to prison for like any time of months. I would just say that it's an absurdity, because there's no like time that's less than 18 months that's going to be any like, if you can't get an associate degree during the time you spend in prison, you shouldn't be there for that amount of time. And I think that's like an arbitrary metric, 2 years. But it's like, how much time does it take to meaningfully accomplish something? It seems like 2 years is a legitimate amount of time. And if you can't see putting somebody in for 2 years, then you shouldn't put them in at all. That's I've never asked that, like, what's the minimum sentence? People always talk about the maximum sentence, but I would say that's like my baseline metric for you should never be sending people to prison for a period of months in that way. Because now people gonna say Dwayne is for the insurrectionists, but you can't have situational ethics when it comes to this stuff.
Oh, we sure will, Dwayne. That Harper's letter, and you're pro-insurrectionist, and so like that's like you're just fucked in every dimension right now. That was an excellent question, Richard.
I want to just add a couple thoughts to this. I think the judge is getting a lot of pretty unfair criticism for this, and I haven't thought about the question of what the minimum sentence for something like this should be. But the complaint that this guy isn't being sent away for more like the guideline sentence, or I think everyone there's 500 plus of these cases, and not one of these people is the platonic example of the rioter insurrectionist that you saw on TV, and you formed a composite in your mind of 50 to 100 different people who were storming the Capitol, and some of them were beating people, some of them were breaking windows and throwing shit around, and sitting at Nancy Pelosi's desk and stealing things. Some of them were just wandering around, shouldn't have been in there, but they didn't do anything other than wander around. And we all have this composite in our mind of this menacing person. In fact, there's 500 very specifically individual cases. And each person did something different. And each person should be sentenced not based on what the aggregate of the crowd did or what the average person did, but what they did. And I think if you don't insist on that principle, you really get into some dangerous territory where, a whole lot of, something bad happened. There's a riot. There was some arson, right? And basically everybody gets sentenced for the worst thing that happened. And I don't believe in that when you're talking about, the LA riots, right? And I don't believe in it in this case either. And so it seems to me if a judge looked at what this person did and said, it's kind of more like trespassing than anything else. He goes into the Senate chamber. He didn't do anything once he was there. He shouldn't have been there. It's elevated to a felony because he entered the chamber. But 8 months feels about right. I'm never going to be the person who says to a federal judge, you got to throw the book at more people, and I just think there's a real temptation to blame each of 500 people for the worst thing that one of 500 people or 50 of 500 people did. And I just say their cases are coming.
And that should just be clear. I mean, I 100% agree with that. That's why I argue that 8 months is a kind of absurd amount of time. And I should say that every day in courts across this country, people, like, if we say that he got 8 months, that means it's closer to trespassing, obviously, right? And every day in courts across this country, people have legitimate robbery charges. And they have facts around the case that lead prosecutors every day in courtrooms across this country not to give a time of months or years in prison. So I don't want people to confuse me and to think I was suggesting he should have got more.
I didn't. No. I took you to be saying at the point at which you're down at 8 months, you should probably be at no jail time at all.
Right.
I'm responding to the people who were insisting that he should have gotten 18 months or more. And I'm saying, look, we do not have a problem in this country with under-sentencing of violent or semi-violent offenses. We just don't.
Right.
And so if a few insurrectionists who are more in the trespassing department get a little bit less time, you're talking about 12 months less time than the guidelines, this is not a huge problem. And I think the possibility, you can't believe in criminal justice reform and believe that the people who particularly offend you should all get a lot of time. There's if you believe in lesser sentencing and a less incarceration, that means that people who did some bad stuff are going to get less time than feels instinctively right to you sometimes. And I have respect for, a federal judge who's, heard all the cases, all the evidence in this case and said, hey, I know the guidelines say 18 months, but.
Yep. No, completely. Yeah, I agree with you. I just really love, Dwayne, I love that point. I've never thought about sentencing from that perspective before in terms of like, I just love the line, like, if you can't get an associate's degree. I love that. I think that's, you said it was kind of just like arbitrary, but I don't actually think that's arbitrary. That seems like a pretty good benchmark. Like, it seems like a good rule, like heuristic to be using. And I don't know, it's just like, but it's also just like, It's a really thought. I know there's a few people at Yale that in the 90s argued for getting rid of jail time for nonviolent offenses, and including, I think, Dan Kahan. But yeah, maybe it's like something that needs to get revisited in general. Just like speaking not about the insurrectionists and everything, but just talking about, like, generally talking about sentence reform.
I mean, the problem though, the radical problem is that, like, if you own your car and you got, a Toyota Camry and there's 130,000 miles on it, you got another 70,000 miles in that car. So you got another 5 or 6 years. Somebody steals your car and they wreck your car. And the insurance company says, "Oh, that's rough. We got you. Your car's worth $895." And you're thinking, wait, $895? The car that I have to buy now to replace that 70,000 miles that I would have been able to use the car for is going to be multiples of 2, 3, 4 times that amount. And like, as a society, we haven't figured out how to balance the harm that property crimes cause with the illegitimacy of some periods of incarceration. And it's much easier to just say, I'm gonna give you 8 months or 12 months than to actually ask in some kind of really radically profound way what was the impact of what this insurrectionist did in a Capitol, what specifically that person did. And as a judge, how do I communicate that to the public? If I'm a judge, I'm not going to want to answer those bigger questions. And I'm going to say my job is to be a judge and to look at the facts and to determine a sentence based on the law that exists. The problem is that just doesn't satisfy anybody in the public. Actually, more often than not, we all end up not satisfied by any response in the court. And the only reason it's okay is because it's like most of the news, we ignore it. What happens in the sentence. I've had people who committed robberies. It was like, and I got negotiated plea bargains, but they did no time. If Connecticut knew, they would be like, huh?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally.
We are gonna leave it there. Dwayne Betts, you're a great American. It's great to see you again. You've got, I like the way the beard is coming along.
Yeah, COVID. Next time y'all invite me, it's going to be here.
Yeah. No, we're going to document. We're eventually going to have like a flip book from your In Lieu of Fun appearances, and you can see the beard grow as you flip through the pages.
Yeah, I'm keeping extra stuff to talk about, but it's always a pleasure to be on with you guys. It's fun. Y'all got a great audience.
Fun. We'll do it again soon. We will be back tomorrow. Genevieve is working on a great guest for tomorrow. We're still not sure if it's coming to be, so I'm not going to announce it yet. But that will be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but Dwayne supports the insurrectionists